Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a modern campaign agency dedicated to using data-driven grassroots organising to build winning campaigns and to make the world a better place. So whether you're in business or an issue-based campaign or an organisation that's driving change in your local community, Dunn Street develops strategies to overcome challenges by connecting people that share the same values and organises them to achieve common goals from the ground up. To find out how Dunn Street can partner with you and bring about change in your local community, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello, my name is Stephen Donnelly and welcome to Ep.6 of Socially Democratic, a weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that will dive into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On today's episode, we'll be joined by Brett Gale, who is the Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre. And Brett will be on to reflect on the policies that Labor took to the most recent federal election and also the policy challenges that Labor and social democratic parties across the globe are facing going forward. It'll be very interesting to hear from Brett about what Chifley is doing in this very important space. Don't forget the podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. So if you're on Apple Podcasts, please give us a rating and leave a review. And for all the updates about the podcast episodes coming up, don't forget to follow Socially Democratic on the Dunn Street social media platforms on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. But up next is Brett Gale. So we're joined on the line from Sydney by the Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre and future starting pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. Brett Gale, welcome to Socially Democratic.
G'day, Stephen. Great to be here. Glad to be here joining from sunny Sydney. Although I think Red Sox need closers at the moment rather than starting pitchers. So I'm happy to transfer to the bullpen for a healthy income increase from what I get currently.
I just checked the score from today's game and saw that was another loss to the Texas Rangers 2 in a row, so it's another series we've dropped. We're going to talk about the Boston Red Sox, but not right now. We're going to do that at the end. I had Josh Burns on. In fact, he was my first guest for the podcast earlier on in the year. And Josh and I both share the love of the NBA. And I said, because this is my podcast now and I pretty much can do whatever I like, you and I are going to talk about the NBA at some point in this podcast. He said, sure, that'd be great. I said, but we probably should put it at the end because if we put it at the start, no one's going to listen to that and therefore not listen to the podcast at all. So I'm going to do a favour with all of our listeners and let them know that we will be talking about the Boston Red Sox and baseball in general, but we'll stick that at the end so if people feel the need to turn off, we won't be offended. But we've got you on here today to talk about policy, really, and that is your role at the Chifley Research Centre. And I thought that we could maybe break down the podcast into two parts, and that is to sort of do a bit of reflection on the election that just happened, and keen to get your thoughts on it from a policy development and execution standpoint, and then maybe focus a bit of forward focus on where social democracy needs to head in terms of developing policy that achieve the things that we want to do for communities. And how do you see Chifley playing a really, really important role in that development? So I thought that could be a good plan for a podcast today.
Sounds fantastic. And I hope people do stick around, particularly the political and baseball nuts who, it can't be just you and I that fit that Venn diagram.
No, it's a very unique Venn diagram. I could name a couple of people who will listen, but then that would be outing them to their family and friends, and I don't know if they want me to do that. So let's start with the campaign. That was look, in the last couple of episodes we've done a couple of had a couple of guests on in which we've sort of talked about the campaign from different aspects. We had Claire Burns, the Victorian Labor Assistant Secretary, on literally the Monday after the election, which is always a difficult conversation to have. Claire put her heart and soul into that campaign and sort of talked about it from a pure campaign perspective. And then we had Dr. Andrea Carson on the podcast last week. She is one of the senior academics at the La Trobe University, and she talked about it from an academic standpoint, and particularly her level of expertise, which is in political communication and journalism and reporting and such. So I thought I'd get you on today to talk more about it from a policy perspective, because this campaign, I don't think you could certainly fault Labor for not having enough policies going into this election. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Look, I think we had a massive policy suite, and I'm not sure that Labor should apologise for having had that. I heard the podcast last week with Andrew, and I think you said something like, which is something that I had said when I had to do a sort of panel a couple of days after the election as well myself, and that is that when you win an election, you clearly have done everything right, and when you lose, you've clearly done everything wrong, and that becomes the status quo belief about what happened in the election going forward. But I think we need to step back, obviously, from that, what belief, and have a look at sort of what really happened. I mean, Labor did go with a great swag of policies. What I think, perhaps in hindsight, that we were lacking was a sort of coherent narrative to wrap it up in a neat bow about what we were trying to achieve and why. I think most of our narrative seemed to focus on the negative about them rather than what does it all mean, this great swath of Labor policy. And I think that in hindsight, we probably should have done a little bit better.
Can it be as simple as, I think it was David Miliband said, never take more than one message to an election campaign. And some people would argue that that's just too simplistic an approach for a campaign. Do you agree with the Miliband approach that you really just need to have one message and just ram it down voters' throats, or is it okay to have a bit of diversity from both a policy setting in terms of the things that you're taking to the electorate, and then how you choose to then communicate all of those policies to those targeted voters?
Yeah, I think they're almost two distinct things. I think you can take a large policy suite to the election, and you don't need to try and talk about every single thing in your policy agenda. And I think that partly is a problem. I agree with Miliband's assessment that you shouldn't be trying to talk to too many things at once, but that doesn't mean you can't have the policies. And that's why I say Labor shouldn't shy away from the fact that it had big, bold policies. And what we need to remember is that, at the end of the day, we won 51% to 49%. We lost, sorry. And, that doesn't mean that we should throw out 100% of the policies, as some people seem to be suggesting. I think we need a period of quiet reflection, think about what did work, what didn't work, in the whole context of what, at the end of the day, went wrong in the campaign. But I don't think we should start from the perspective that says, let's throw everything out. We should start from the perspective that says, let's look at everything and let's think about all of these things we've put together. Undoubtedly, we did have a policy suite that scared people. And one of the questions we need to ask ourselves, getting back to the message, is that at a time when Australians are feeling uncertain and uncertain about their future, uncertain about their jobs, uncertain about their wages, was presenting a wall of policy the best way forward? But similarly, we gave ourselves only 6 weeks to talk about the positive things we were doing. And I think in hindsight, again, that might have been a mistake. So we had been making the case for a number of years on the revenue side of the budget and what we were going to do, and the changes we were making there and why we were making them. But in an environment when people are not switched in that much to politics, and only so what they picked up was, in a sense, that we were going to bring in new taxes without necessarily understanding the full detail of it. I think relying on the conventional approach that left all the goodies to the 6-week period of the campaign, when all indications were that people were going to be switched off and not interested because they're switched off and not interested in politics in general these days, was a mistake. We probably should have been out there earlier talking about the benefits of what we were doing. So talking about our changes to childcare, for instance, which would have genuinely put money back in people's pockets, were a genuine wage boosting measure. But unfortunately, we announced them on the first Sunday of the campaign, and that's not enough time, I think, for people to get the message through. And as I say, it's a traditional, conventional approach to campaigning where you say, let's throw our goodies out in the campaign, let's not release them too early. But I think in this case, because we did have such a big agenda, putting more on the table of what we were doing to people, earlier would have been a better approach.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought you have there, because part of the criticism that's happened from the commentariat since the election was that Labor made the mistake that John Hewson made, which was they went with a big target strategy in saying that this is what we're all about. Judge us and vote for us on this, and we'll suffer the consequences or have a great result on election night. But John Hewson brought out the Fight Back package in 1993, more than 12 months out from the election, and so it gave both his opponents and also his own party time to either sell or to attack that policy setting. That was one, when people make those comparisons between this election and 1993, I think there are fundamental differences, and that is, and you just alluded to it there, is that, yeah, we had some big initiatives, but we never sort of brought them out, apart from franking credits and the negative gearing policy, which was actually 3 years old, or maybe even longer. Most of the stuff we did bring out that was quite substantial did come out quite late in the campaign context. And something that I found that was been... John Howard certainly didn't want to make that mistake in 1996. It got to the point when he was announcing policies, literally days out from the election, and doing it in a manner that couldn't even be critiqued by the journalists, because he would do the doorstop or the media event and then hand out the notes about the policy as he's getting back on the bus to go to the next location, so they can't ask him questions about that. So it's a fundamental shift in the way that campaigns and how they communicate their policies to their audiences. What I saw different from, say, Daniel Andrews in 2014 was that they made their announcements, significant, major announcements about infrastructure, about job creation, about health, about education, 12 months out, and just talked about them ad nauseum. Now, sure, in the campaign itself, in 2014, they made smaller announcements around those big ticket items, but ultimately the electorate had plenty of time to consume that. So, are you saying that you don't think that Labor really, for the good stuff they had to talk about with the electorate, they just didn't bring them out early enough?
That's right. I think the Daniel Andrews analogy is perfect. As you say, big ticket items talked about for 12 months. And we had some really positive changes in what we're proposing. And I don't think that 6 weeks was enough time for those to sink into people. And the difference between now and previous generations is people's attention spans as well. There's back in the day, well, John Howard was deliberately doing that because he knew that he was coasting to victory, which turned out to be true, I guess. So he thought he could get away with it, and he did. And unfortunately, the lesson that we had all learned since then was that if you curl up into a little ball and don't say anything, then you can get elected. But what I'd say is that didn't work for Labor in 98. It didn't work for Labor in 2001 or any other election before that. Because when you are a social democratic party, you do need to enunciate what change you're going to bring, what you're going to do to make the country better. But in the modern era, I think, where people are distracted by their phones and their Netflix and all sorts of things, and not, the saturation of the media like it used to be, the dominance of TV like it used to be, doesn't cut through as much. So leaving things to announce to the campaign, you are handicapping yourself in terms of getting your message out to the people that might benefit.
I don't know if you noticed last week on last week's podcast with Dr. Andrea Carson, she mentioned that she felt that Labor's policies produced too many winners and losers amongst the voting cohort, and she cited the cancer policy announcement as one of them, in which she was saying, well, why not extend it to beyond Why specifically pick out cancer patients as an area for a major policy or health announcement? Why not? Because that automatically alienates voters that have not suffered from that experience. Do you think that there were winners and losers, and therefore creating losers that inhibited our pathway to victory on election day?
Look, I'd put it in a different context. I think that, one of the things that I studied in my life, and that still sticks in my head, of the few things that stick in my head, was behavioural economics. And one of the key tenets of behavioural economics is that people feel losses more acutely than they feel gains. So, there were people who were going to lose from some of our policies. We were unashamed about that. But what I think that behavioural economics framework means is you have to try a hell of a lot harder to make sure that the people getting gains understand they're getting the gains, because the people who are feeling the losses will certainly be vocal about telling you that, or at least having it sink into them that you are attacking them and taking their losses out. So I'm not necessarily sure we set up, a framework of sort of winners and losers in that respect. I think the cancer policy, went to a acute medical condition that many Australians are aware of and understand implicitly and completely. Whereas and they can relate to the concept of the out-of-pocket bills that arise with cancer care. So yes, during the campaign there were other groups saying, well, what about us? Why aren't my health being funded? But I think at the end of the day, it's not a limitless bucket of money, and cancer is still one of the greatest causes of death in Australia. So picking at one mass thing is not necessarily a negative. However, as I say, when you had other losers where we actually were taking people away, not just I didn't get the same thing as that other person, then I think we really did need to double our efforts to make sure that the people benefiting from our policies understood them and felt like they were going to benefit. And as I say, I think the classic example are the changes we were going to make to the childcare rebate, which would have put a lot of money back into people's pockets, would have allowed the second earner in a family to go back into the workforce without the what we know as the childcare penalty, where for some people it's not worth working 4 or 5 days a week because the childcare costs outstrip it, and that was a fundamentally good policy that would have had all the benefits that we know about from childcare and all the benefits we know about getting people back into the workforce for the productivity of the economy. Yet, as I say, leaving ourselves only 6 weeks to sell it, it's a bit difficult. That should have been a policy we were out there selling, in every childcare centre for the last 12 months.
Kevin Rudd in the 07 election, the successful election for Labor, pitched himself to the electorate as an economic conservative and tried to, and I guess you could argue successfully, negate any attack from the right on his economic credentials, and basically was saying to the electorate, look, if you trusted John Howard over the last however many years, you can trust me too, because I'm just the same, but I'm doing a whole bunch of other things as well. That is the difference between myself and the Prime Minister. Do you think in this election campaign, from a policy setting, that we were a little bit too bold when it came to the economic side of the argument, or were we just were we taken by surprise by how well the Tories could construct an argument that put the fear of God into voters around taxation?
Yeah. Look, I think that's a great piece to think about. I mean, certainly, we were bold and therefore, in a sense, constructed a framework that could be used against us, and could be used against us in a fear and a scared way. But I don't think we should discount the role of Clive Palmer's money in stoking that fear around that agenda. You know, 60, 50, whatever it was, $70 million is a hell of a lot of money. So a quick story. My daughter, who is 10, the week leading up to the election, sort of the Tuesday before the election, you know, she says to me as I'm making her breakfast before school, she says, "Oh, Daddy, do kids have to vote the same way as their parents?" You know,
And you said, of course they do.
Worry about this, and I'm like, well, if you want to keep living in this house, you know, and eating food here, and you know, getting toys, you do. But what I actually said was, well, you know, of course not. But you know, here's the reasons your mother and I vote Labor, and here's, you know, and they're the sort of values you've talked about. And I mentioned some speeches she'd given at school where she'd talked about the things that Labor traditionally does for people, and she nods her head sagely, and then she says, "You know, but I'm just worried about all these taxes, Daddy." Now, she's 10 years old, right? So she's never paid a tax in her life. She doesn't actually know what a tax is. But, you know, she spends, like all 10-year-olds, every time on YouTube and various other things. And, you know, the saturation of Palmer's message, anti-Labor message about taxes, you know, completely non-targeted everywhere, sunk through. And I think that, you know, he essentially did the Liberal Party's advertising for them. So you can criticise Labor for creating the I guess bold tax framework. You can't understand that the fear campaign around it and the scare, which were, you know, some blatant falsehoods, including Labor will raise $1 trillion worth of tax, or whatever Palmer's ads were saying in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. I don't think we can discount that at all as being a factor, rather than just the policies themselves. You know, and then of course, you know, the Liberals with their death taxes scare campaign as well. You know, they were playing into a framework that had been created. But you know, the combination of all those things, I think, on top of the policy, you know, certainly harmed us. Not just the policy itself, I think.
After every election loss, we go through this ritual self-mutilation sort of process of debating about whether we've moved too far to the left when it comes to policy settings, if we've moved too far to the right. It's like clockwork. It happens every time. I just want to get your thoughts on that, and then sort of broaden that out to a conversation about social democratic parties and where we go from here, because certainly at a federal level, we're not, you know, we're starting to paint a pretty ugly picture for Labor, and it almost makes the Hawke-Keating years a fluke that we had such success, because we, you know, for a while they started to say, "Oh, we're now the party of government," but if you look back since post-war, you know, those statistics about how many times we've won elections is pretty dim. And then looking at the results of a lot of the social democratic parties in Europe, most recently, both in the European parliamentary elections and also in their own national elections, things aren't going great for social democratic parties. What's your thoughts on where the Labor Party needs to position itself in turning to the future when it comes to policy development and just being electable?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first starting point we need to take in Australia is that the result was relatively close. So, you know, so this is the the third out of the last four elections where it's been, you know, within the 51 to 49 bracket, one way or the other. And, you know, so I think we are dealing with a heavily polarized, almost equally balanced, fragmented sort of body politic and voting public. And that's the first thing we need to overcome. And I think in terms of that, some of that does go to the messaging as well as the policy development. And that means we really need to work out what sort of message we have for the whole of Australia, for the whole country. Because you're right, there is a fear around the world, and you see it particularly in some US results, but particularly in Europe, that there is a fracturing of what one might call the social democratic coalition, the sort of big umbrella that sort of existed for 50 odd years since the sort of late 60s, early 70s, where social democrats were able to cobble together their traditional working class supporters, and the icing on top of the electoral cake that helped us win elections was getting sort of slightly more well-off people who are involved, who believed in progressive values around lifestyle. Now, that coalition, particularly in Europe, seems to be fracturing. It's in fact, the Steve Bannon makes no secret of the fact that he would love to create a working class party of the right. That's his sort of fantasy political movement. But we do see this, in Europe in particular, with Brexit, where traditionally Labour areas voted for a sort of pro-nationalist, nativist, stay-at-home sort of outlook, whereas sort of more progressive Labour areas voted heavily to remain in the European Union based on sort of this globalist, view of the world. So these sort of tectonic plates are shifting in the body politic around the world. I think the difference with Europe and Australia is that a lot of the social democratic parties in Europe have been stung by actually being too close to the right. Germany is a classic example, but some of the others as well. That when the global financial crisis hit, what they relied on was either they were in coalition with the right, particularly in Germany, where they brought in austerity measures, and therefore it wasn't the Conservatives who copped the blame for that. It was the Social Democrats, because their traditional base just went, well, if you're going to do that to us, we may as well leave you and vote for somebody else who's going to talk our talk.
The same thing happened in the Republic of Ireland as well.
Yeah, exactly. And one could argue probably Britain, although it's one would think that potentially the sort of Blair Brown government had run out of steam after 15 years anyway. But enacting austerity and those sort of measures. I mean, the contrast to Australia under our government's response to the GFC couldn't have been more pronounced. I mean, we were strong with stimulus and looked after people, but that we in hindsight probably didn't get enough credit, because people never felt threatened, because most people's jobs never ended up being in danger. But I think some of the results we're seeing in this election, particularly in sort of working class areas in Queensland, but even working class areas in Western Sydney, is swings against Labor. And we need to really take a long, hard look and a think about that, and work out whether this in Australia is a presage of this fracturing of the social democratic coalition that we see in Europe, or is an anomaly. And now we need to have a think about whether the fact that we have compulsory voting and compulsory preferential voting here has papered over that crack for the last little while. And if there's tectonic plates are shifting, it's a pretty sobering and depressing place, I think, for social democrats and particularly traditional Labor parties, because if we lose the working class base, then we've lost the entire traditions of why we exist as a movement and as a Labor Party. So we need to spend a fair bit of time, I think, looking at that and working out what policies work for those people, but also what message. We do need to think about what message we were sending the traditional working class voters in this election, and whether or not we had the right policies for them as well as for other people.
Yeah, the question about the working class and the relationship it has with the Labor Party is very cool right now amongst some people in our broader movement. I don't know whether it's a resurgence of hipsters who are trying to all reclaim that they're apparently got working class roots or not. But I have found it interesting, certainly over not just this election campaign, but the last 2 or 3 election cycles, this view that the Labor Party is drifting from its working class base. I went and had a look at the primary voting results for Labor in a traditional working class electorate in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, the seat of Cornwall. And I went back as far as 1990, And it's interesting to see the primary vote of Labor in that electorate, because it actually fluctuates. It effectively fluctuates from as low as 45% primary for Labor in 1990 to as high as 62% for Labor in 1998. But it ebbs and flows. And in fact, at the most recent election, the 2019 election, our primary vote in the seat of call was 53%. In 2016, it's at 56%. So we've obviously had a swing away from us in this most recent election. But in 2013, our primary vote was below 50. In 2004, it was bang on 50. In 2001, it was bang on 50. In 2007, it was up around 60. So it peaks and troughs. So I mean, I know this is only one small sample, but I'm just not completely buying this argument right now that the working class are deserting the Labor Party. And you may be right. You do make a really interesting point when you say that because we have both preferential voting and compulsory voting, it may be papering over the cracks because it's forcing people. But certainly looking at a primary vote, that is a working class voter or a voter, I should say, putting a 1 next to the Labor Party candidate. Certainly in working class, traditional working class areas, our vote goes up and down with the success of our party, really. And there isn't some sort of, like, if you can look at some seats in both the United States and in Britain where over a long sustained period of time the working class vote has deserted Labor. But I don't think we're seeing that here in Australia just yet. And it leads, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Brett, it leads to this sort of argument within the party about there's different schools of thought about what type of party we are. Are we a working class party? Are we the party of the inner city urban elite? Or beyond that, are we a party that's about this sort of outer suburban and regional middle class? Because let's not forget that ultimately you win elections when the middle class vote for you. That's certainly in Australia because we have compulsory voting. That's that is the key to success. But I feel the answer to who our identity is, or Labor's identity, is actually all three of them. And when all three of those groups vote for Labor at the ballot box, that's when we win. I think Daniel Andrews achieved that in 2018. Steve Bracks consistently did that. Mike Rand, Bob Carr, Beattie, Hawke, all through the 80s. So the hard part, I guess, is from a policy setting, how do you develop policies that are attractive to those three reasonably diverse groups of people? And what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly how Labor wins elections, and that's why the questioning around whether that broad coalition is fracturing is, I think, one we do need to spend some time thinking about, because you're absolutely right. We do need those three groups of people to vote for us to win, to bring us over the line. I mean, I tend not to take the seat of Lindsay as a litmus test because my view is Lindsay is and has been for most of the past 30 years, or at least the last sort of 20 plus years, a Liberal seat that Labor occasionally wins. But it is a what you might call middle-class aspirational seat in some respects. And so I think you do need to marry those three groups together completely to form the coalition that can get us over the line. And at the end of the day, can give us 76 plus seat we need to win. Now, I don't think it's impossible to craft a policy platform that can appeal to those three groups. I mean, we talked a lot about wages in this election, and you and I will come back and talk about wages and wage stagnation sort of when we look at policies going forward. But I think that we had great policies for trying to look after sort of the lower end of the wage scale, if you like, bring back penalty rates. Calling for a living wage rather than a minimum wage. They're fantastic, but they're not the only wages in Australia that have gone backwards or stagnated in recent years. And I think what was missing from our policy armament was, and I think this is a fault of, this is a problem for the entire Labor movement. We need to solve this, not just the political arm of the Labor movement. What is our wages policy for those who, one might call middle class, who've also seen their wages stagnated. And I'm not sure we had a policy for them. As I say, the childcare policy would have put some money in people's pockets, would have been an actual wage increase. But I'm not sure that we had a specific wages policy that would go to the concerns of those people. But if we had of, it goes to your essential thesis about how do you marry policy for those sort of disparate groups that traditionally we need as a broad coalition for us to win.
Yeah, and that's my natural go-to here is an answer that's not about policy. It's an answer about messaging, because I think that perhaps our policies, in terms of trying to address wage equality and wage stagnation, are not easily addressed, but that it will take time, and I think that Labor would eventually get there. But I think in the urgency of an election campaign, James Carville always said, your opponent can't talk shit about you if you've got your fist in his mouth. And on the issue of wages, I felt that perhaps what we should have been saying to the electorate was, John Howard said that he wouldn't bring in work choices, and he did. Malcolm Turnbull said he wouldn't reduce penalty rates, and he did. Scott Morrison is going to cut your wages, and he will. You need to vote Labor, and just put the fear of God into workers out there saying, if you're feeling the pinch about wage stagnation and you want something different, you don't vote for that lot, because you know what they've got form on this issue, and there is an alternative. You should be voting for us, and just hammer that home for the last 5 weeks of the campaign.
I couldn't agree more. I actually think, even taking it a step further and using one other Americanism, a narrative that had been crafted around, there's that old American saying about every time the election comes around, do you feel better off than you were 4 years ago? If Labor had crafted a narrative around, do you feel that you are better off than you were 6 years ago? The overwhelming answer to that, of course, would have been no. Put the heat back on the government for their mismanagement of the economy, and for, in Matthias Cormann's words, their deliberate, structural plan to decrease and flatten wages. I think absolutely, it goes to messaging, not necessarily policy. I think that was a missed opportunity for us to drive home that message about things are worse than they were when the Liberals came to power, when it comes to your everyday living standards and your everyday ability to buy things and to get wage increases. And we don't have to look further than the governor of the Reserve Bank and the deputy governor of the Reserve Bank to hear them saying the same things, that they're worried about wage stagnation. So it was fertile ground there waiting for us that I think, unfortunately, we let slip through our fingers.
Let's turn our attention to the future. And I thought that we could maybe address sort of three areas of policy that I think are both most urgent for Australians, but also very much something that Labor or social democratic parties around the world actually kind of need to get a handle on. Otherwise, they're going to get wedged on it constantly. And those three areas I want to talk to you about is climate, the economy, and broadly speaking, employment and wages and security, and population growth and migration and the things that come out of that. Let's continue on this conversation that we've just been talking about, the economy and employment. I had a conversation with someone in the union movement in the lead up to the election campaign. They were talking about the Change the Rules campaign, and I was just saying to them, this is such a great, such fertile ground for the union movement going into this particular campaign, and even if there wasn't a campaign on right now, an election campaign, but even just a general campaign that the union movement was seeking to run, I don't think there's been another time that I can consider in certainly years that I've been involved in politics in which there's such consensus amongst the community about wage stagnation and people feeling the pressure, that here is a great opportunity for the union movement to say, well, one of the simple ways in which we can fix that is that you need to get organised in your workplace and use the power of collective bargaining in your workplace to try and seek to improve your wages and conditions. And I put that to this union organiser, And I said, are workers, be that union members or non-union members, coming to that natural conclusion that that's one way in which they can fix these problems is for themselves to, collectively empower change at a workplace level? And he said, no, they don't see the union movement or unions as a solution to the problem when it comes to wage stagnation, which is fascinating in itself. And I don't think that we would have thought that 30 or 40 years ago. That's the first, and I just want to put that to you and say that this is the challenges for the broader movement, that if workers can't even come to that conclusion, then we've got a long, long way to go to try and fix the problems from a policy setting. Let's start with that, get your thoughts on that, and then let's maybe branch out a bit and talk about, globalisation and disruption and the other things that are starting to happen with the fast-pacing change of our economy.
Yeah, well, that's a great example of the success, I think, of the right in 40 years, maybe longer, of demonising, well, probably longer actually, of demonising the union movement and the role of unions. I think the fact that, as you say, you would think that conditions have never been more propitious for people to actually realise that in unity is strength, as we say, that joining together in collective action might help them. But it is, I guess, in one sense, the logical outcome of, as I say, decades of demonising unions, and also decades of hammering home a message that the individual is paramount, that you, the individual, are in charge of your own destiny. And this I put down to a success of consistent right-wing messaging over a long period of time. And this is something that, from a wider perspective, I'll if you indulge me for a minute, that we in the left have been not very good at, I think, over recent times. We seem to believe that, fall back on the fact that because we have the right morality on our side, that people will automatically agree with us and not have paid attention to the fact that the things we hold dear and the structures that we believe in have been consistently undermined and demonised for 40 years, with the help occasionally of social democratic governments, actually. But it is, and it's work that actually starts in right-wing think tanks. I mean, this you'd be well aware of the concept of the Overton window about what is acceptable in public debate and shifting it. And there's plenty of evidence over the last numerous numbers of decades of right-wing think tanks and right-wing cheer squads pushing out the bounds of acceptable public policy debate and pushing it in a right-wing direction, so that when conservative governments get in, the things that they enact seem actually normal and timid compared to the things that the right-wing cheer squads and think tanks have been calling for. Now, I think and it's incumbent upon groups like Chifley and other progressive think tanks as well, but the broader sort of socially democratic progressive movement itself to begin trying to push that Overton window back the other way, to try and be a bit more left wing. Now our parliamentary representatives don't have to go as far as we are, but what we should be doing is pushing the debate so that we can redress some of the balance on this stuff. Because, as I say, it is a crying shame that in this current age, with wages stagnating and with evidence from around the world of wages stagnating, we can't get people thinking that maybe collective action, maybe joining together, might help them. Even again, when we have the Reserve Bank governor sort of intimating that maybe that is one of the solutions. So I think we are in a real bind when it comes to wages and what to do about it if we're not getting collective action. Of course, that's overlaid with rules, regulations, restrictions that conservative government have put in place that make it harder and harder to collectively organise.
Which is essentially what the Change the Rules campaign was trying to achieve.
Yeah, exactly right, and that was exactly the right track to try and achieve that and redress that, because that is one of the impediments to workplace bargaining and to collective action. But I think that what we need to begin thinking about as policy proponents is, do we need, a more radical approach? If, and again, this can only be enacted, I guess, by social democratic governments, but if we're not going to get take up for collective bargaining, do we have to think about what sort of a system we have where, if union membership is so low, people are not still willing to join unions. In fact, some workplaces and ways of working, do not lend themselves at all to collective bargaining with the increasing casualisation of work. Do we need some mechanism, I guess, that sets up a proxy for workers? It's sort of been thrown out of the window now, but the old tripartite industrial relations commissions that were brokering deals between government, employers and workforces gave people real wage increases. I think, and I don't have a solution, but I think, thinking about radical solutions that don't necessarily have to be, exactly that, but replicate those conditions that allow workers to have some sort of a say, are something that we really seriously need to think about if we are going to get wages moving again, rather than capital just completely taking a greater share of productivity increases when they happen.
Here's a radical idea. In the 1980s, as you know, the Hawke government entered into an accord with the union movement in an effort to control wage growth. Now we have a problem in which we have too little wage growth. Is it time that government, and this will only be a Labor government that will do this, enter into an accord with business to say to them, we have to get wages moving again. We've created an industrial relations system that it's almost impossible for workers to bargain to improve wages, so we are going to have an accord with you, which will give you concessions, but at the same time, you have to start to increase wages for the workforce. That sounds like government intervening way too much in capital, but is that something that is? It just seems like we need to restore some sort of balance here in the favour of workers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I guess what I'm getting at. That what are the radical solutions we need to think about to redress that? A lot of people in business, know that having stagnant wages is not in their long-term interests, but they're also, they fall back on, well, we've got to give return to shareholders, we've got to do a list. So, even looking at corporate law rules, corporate law regulations that give primacy to shareholders above any other stakeholder group of companies, is something that Labor governments could look at. But certainly, if businesses themselves won't voluntarily do this, what are the carrots and sticks that governments can look at to help them to bring people together? And as you say, perhaps they are, carrots on various things, as there were with the Accords of the 90s, the 80s, sorry. But I do think what we need to think about are what are creative solutions to this impasse, because it seems to me that we are stuck in this bind where people say, oh, it's all terrible wage stagnation, yet we're still reliant on a strong, organised, unionised workforce that probably will never come back. If we believe that that's the solution, well, we might be holding our breath for a long time. As much as those of us who are allies and friends and members of the union movement would like to see a greater increase in union membership, it seems increasingly hard that will be achieved. So we do need to begin plotting, thinking about what are the innovative, if people don't like the word radical, what are the innovative solutions we can come up to that as I say, what is the proxy for what was once the strength of unions to represent workers? What can we come up with as a proxy for giving workers some balance back in this debate?
Let's turn our attention to climate for a moment. This issue has been the policy Achilles heel for all sides of politics over the past decade, from the Greens voting down policies that put a price on carbon through to the internal debates within the Liberal Party. that keeps bringing down prime ministers. Who do you think is going to be the first to land a national climate policy that's both good for the future of our environment and doesn't hurt working Australians, or is attractive to working Australians and is bulletproof to short-term political attacks?
Yeah, this is another one where, in my most depressing moments, I think that maybe we should give up on the idea of federal action on climate change. And ask ourselves a question: have the climate deniers demonised and poisoned the well, as it were, on climate change action so badly that at a federal level it's a very difficult thing to do and almost intractable problem to solve? And maybe, should those of us who believe in action on climate change be placing our energies, towards state governments and local governments and businesses that want to do the right thing and are increasingly doing the right thing, and even individuals and consumers that want to do the right thing. Now that's I guess in my darker, more depressing moments about climate action, but it is one way forward. We don't have time to keep sitting around over and over and over again fighting the same fights we've had federally for the last decade or more. There are state Labor governments around the place. There are local councils who are interested. There are businesses. Maybe those of us who care about climate should spend some of our energy getting those bodies to enact action on climate change, so at least we get something moving. But at a federal level, I think we need to overcome the sort of, again, this is a narrative problem, I think, with climate change. We haven't been good at explaining to people, or in fact coming up with the exact policy solutions that can allay the fears of those people who quite rightly are worried about their jobs and worried about their power bills in a time of straitened living circumstances. And partly that's because, those in favour of climate action tend to talk to people and just believe in what one might call a rational way, rather than to the emotional part of people's brains, and seem to think that if we just recite the facts to people, eventually they will sink in. And that's not the way you communicate with people, and that's not the way you convince people to come along with you for the journey. So I do think that we need a new frame in how we talk to people who are not outright deniers, but sceptical about climate change, or worried about what radical change might do to their job and to their lifestyle and to their cost of living. We need to really reframe the debate, and people are doing things in their own lifestyle. There are large parts of North Queensland, Central Queensland, where Labor lost votes. Some would say on the back of Adani, where the take up of solar panels on people's roofs is huge. So people are doing things in their own lives. We just need to stop hectoring, which is a favourite sport of people on the left, this culture of scolding people for not doing the right thing, and actually begin talking to people about how they see the problems and how they see the solutions. We need to come up with an answer to the question that always comes up about what can Australia alone do? Why should we act by ourselves? I think there are answers to that question that we can put easily, but we don't seem to be very good at explaining them to people. And likewise, if we are going to have climate change policies, we cannot divorce them from a wider industry policy about jobs. And the discussion about jobs needs to be much more concrete, much more about how people will benefit, much more about what will happen to somebody who loses a job from taking climate action, and giving people a clear path, rather than the industries will just come and replace it. It's unless we can crack that nut, and unless we can come up with a policy suite that answers both of those sort of conundrums, addressing action on climate change and reassuring people about what the pathway is to a future for them in terms of a decent standard of living and a decent job, then we will always be wedged and we will always come off second best.
Is the debate lacking a voice from the corporate sector who do recognise, whether they recognise it from a moral perspective or if they recognise it from a bottom, from a budgetary perspective or a business proposition, that climate change is something that they need to invest in? Because there certainly are plenty of big multinational organisations that are investing heavily in the climate and sustainable, sustainability and wind farms and renewable energy. Are we not? Are they just quietly going about their business and doing that? Do we need to hear more from them in those conversations at a government level to perhaps try and kill off this fear that exists in the broader general community about I worry about climate change and I worry about my kids' future, but ultimately I've got to put food on the table, so that's actually my number one priority. How do we I'm looking towards business to say, where are you guys on this? Why are you not a little bit louder when it comes to talking about this debate and trying to push back?
Absolutely. And if you think back 12 years ago, businesses were active. Businesses were strong. At the time that Howard came reluctantly to the concept of an emissions trading scheme, businesses were out there calling for this stuff. They were strong. They were positive. It was only when the Conservative parties began, the destructive path of demonising all climate action, that business community began to shut up shop. So I think it is important that business come out strongly on this. But and it doesn't even have to necessarily be in a political way. It can be in a way that is simply showcasing what they're doing and the fact that they take it seriously as an issue. And, here we are. Here's my wind farm. Here's what I'm doing as a company to reduce my own emissions. Business could be much louder at that and that by implication, that's not setting up a fight with with the Conservatives that they are more aligned with. It is actually just showing the Conservatives that stuff is happening, whether they like it or not. But I do think business has been largely absent in this debate for a number of years, and that's, as I say, partly because they've been beat up by the Conservative skeptics and deniers, but also, for their own reasons. And I think it's really important that they do add their voice to that debate. That's what I say, and for climate activists as well, continuing to work on business, particularly those who do take this issue seriously, I think is a really important strategy in the next little while going forward. While ever we have a federal government that clearly is not interested in doing one thing about addressing climate change.
Turning our attention just quickly before we wrap up to population growth and migration, I feel like there are two sort of stories that are happening in this country right now, and you can feel it the minute you cross the Murray River. Certainly in New South Wales, and particularly for Sydney people, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on this as a Sydney sider, that population growth is of concern, particularly in the outer suburbs of Sydney. Whereas, down here in Victoria, you've kind of got this feel from Daniel Andrews' leadership that we've taken this sort of Statue of Liberty approach to migration. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. If you know how to write code, we'll take you. And Victoria, on current projections, will overtake New South Wales as the most populous state in the next 10 years. Where are we on this sort of population growth debate, and what policies do? Because Labor I find that Labor are nervous about talking about this, the scars of the Howard years when it came to migration, and the overlay of that is refugees as well. For a long, long time, it was a bipartisan position. It was bloody Fraser that opened the doors to take in all the refugees from the Vietnam War, for God's sake. But now it seems to become this sort of issue that it's a tar baby we just don't want to touch. But at the same time, for a young country like Australia that needs to continue to prime our economy, we need more people. what's Chifley's thoughts on getting that policy setting right that both is great for our economy, but also, palatable to a community that is worried about, infrastructure and just resources in their own community to get to and from work?
Yeah, it is a muddled mess, unfortunately, that as you say, crosses over all of those things. Fear for whatever reason of people coming and lack of control of borders, which ties into where Conservatives have been very effective at wedging Labor on refugee policy and other things, but also with the day-to-day sense that getting around is harder, that we lack infrastructure, we lack services. And I think in one sense we should, try and break the nexus between those things. They should be, refugees should be a conversation we're having about refugees and refugee policy, separate to allowing, refugees to be demonised for the fact that our cities are overcrowded, because we know that's an absolute bollocks. That's not the reason our cities are overcrowded. It is for many years a lack of proper infrastructure, proper services, investment, mainly from state governments. And I think people are much more comfortable with population growth if they think they can get around, if their daily commute to work, if their daily commute to pick up the kids, if their daily weekend going to kids' sport or whatever, or even just out to a movie or whatever is not sort of made particularly onerous because of lack of transport options, lack of services. So I think a much bigger, and this is unfortunately something that people have been talking about for the last dozen years, particularly as interest rates were around the world were at all-time lows. Greater investment in infrastructure across a whole range of issues is vitally important. But it is, and that lack of services, that lack of infrastructure, that feeling of frustration about it is actually something the current federal government tapped into quite well in the election campaign. When I saw their federal budget, part of me laughed and went, well, there's a whole bunch of state government type things in this federal budget, funding for commuter car parks, funding for various other services that are traditionally the remit of state government being done directly on hire from the federal government. But, in terms of tapping into a sentiment that people feel, they were sort of the right policies. Fixing up infrastructure so that people's daily lives are easier, I think, is a massive step on the way to getting people to accept higher population growth and higher levels of immigration. It's when people feel that we're just getting more and more people and services are getting run down and it's getting harder and harder to get around, that resentment to immigration rises, I think. So we do need, to have a holistic approach and a really deep approach to the infrastructure, particularly of our major cities, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And you're right, Melbourne will overtake Sydney in terms of population. And that's why I think the sort of policy agenda that Daniel Andrews has taken to the last two elections, which was squarely aimed at infrastructure, and then actually living up to that by actually delivering on the infrastructure changes he'd promised, so that when he was up for election the second term, there was a track record of achievement for him to point to and say, look at this. And people then, when he says, well, I've got these other, the rail loop and various other longer-term infrastructure policy proposals, people believe him and believe they can be delivered. But it's core bread and butter.
Who knew that doing what you say and saying what you do was a good recipe for electoral success?
Indeed.
Let's just broadly talk about what the focus of Chifley will be in the coming next 12 to 18 months in this sort of post-election defeat, and where your energies will be focused on from a policy development sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as the official think tank of the Labor Party, I think we have a sort of unique remit in what we should do and where we should go, and it also gives us a bit of leeway. So, some of these big picture issues that we've touched on today, we'll be looking at over the next little while. Particularly the idea of how do we maintain the social democratic base? That's a big area of issue that we are interested in pursuing. We'll be working towards it's become a tradition for Chifley to host a major sort of conference looking ahead for the Labor movement sort of post the election. So we are looking to try and host one of those at the end of the year, where we can actually have a big deep dive and a serious discussion about the sort of policy issues that we have touched on in our conversation today. I personally am interested in shifting conversations on the future of work from the sort of what might call the superficial level that it exists at the moment, where people it's either we're all going to be ruined because of robots, so give us a UBI, or no, it's all going to be great because of robots and we've already adapted and we adapt many times, to actually what are the actual policies we need to do to prepare people for automation. Whether the outcome is going to be the former or the latter, sort of Armageddon or increased productivity. Either way, we need people prepared. But at the moment, we seem stuck in this stasis in conversations about the future of work, where we just go round and round in a circle talking between those two binary choices. Whereas I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about, what are the actual policy prescriptions we need to put in place to prepare people for the workforce of the future, and to help people through with transitions. I mean, one thing we need to look at is there's a lot of jibber jabber about the concept of lifelong learning, and people should be lifelong learning, and that will prepare them for the future. But the problem with the current debate in that sphere is it all relies on you, the individual. It's like, you should be looking after your own future. You should be the one getting lifelong learning. Well, no, if there are societal structural changes happening, then it's going to take getting back to the idea of a tripartite accord type agreement, it's going to take a tripartite conversation between, government, which provides educational opportunities, between employers who should actually care about guaranteeing the skills of their workforce, and employers and employees themselves. What are sort of policies do we need to enact in that space? How do we get that sort of tripartite agreement? So there's some of the things we'll be looking at. But I'm quite, excited by the fact that we'll be having this conference at the end of the year, where we can thrash out a whole bunch of issues, about where to next for social democracy.
It's amazing and incredibly important work that Chifley does for the party in this policy development space. There are ways in which punters out there, social democrats, can give their support to Chifley. So here's your chance, Brett, to give it a bit of a plug. What ways can people actually get involved? Is it mailing list?
Excellent. Well, one of the things that, our vision of Chifley is to create what we call a labour culture of ideas. And what I'd like to see is, I'd really like to, we have a number of platforms, but particularly a blog space. I'd really like, social democratically aligned people, Labor aligned people, to really dig in and start debating some of these issues. Our blog space is an open forum. I would love to see it used more by people, as a place to express their opinions and express their policy conversations. We take contributions, but I think having that conversation across the wider Labor movement is going to be really important for us, particularly coming off the back of, what was a shock for all of us, election loss that nobody, I think, in the Labor movement was expecting, and certainly, very few people around the country were expecting or prepared for it. So I think it's a really important time now for people to start expressing ideas and to having those policy debates inside our party, inside our movement. And Chifley, as I say, is about creating that Labor culture of ideas. So we welcome contributions to the blog and the website in that respect. And also come along to our events when we have them. We try to have regular events where policy is discussed. I've been in this job 18 months, and I'm constantly happily amazed at and gratified at the thirst for discussion of actual policy there is amongst people in Australia and Labor supporters in particular. I think because so much of the political coverage we have is the horse race type coverage and the sort of inside, Canberra type coverage and what's going on and what machinations is happening rather than a conversation. People are actually hungry to have a conversation. So, I thank all the people who've come to our events and, hope to put on many more and hope people will come to many more because we want to have that conversation. We want to have that discussion.
I saw it firsthand last year when, in my old role as Assistant Secretary of the party, we organised the Labor Activist Conference out at Holmes Glen TAFE in Chadstone. And one of the sessions that was run that day was by your good self in your capacity at Chifley, and it was a packed room.
No, it was fantastic, and it was great questions and great engagement, and because people are interested, and that speech I gave was based around the concept of good policy is good politics, and if we go back right to where we started our conversation today, I still believe that, and and it's why we do need to keep fighting for good policy inside the Labor movement.
So if they do want to jump on that blog space, how do they go about it? Should they go to your website or what's the...
So the website is www.chifley.org.au, and there's some links through there to get in touch with us in terms of wanting to contribute and stuff like that. So happy to have conversations with people, happy to take contributions. And of course, always happy for other more tangible, less ideas-focused forms of support as well, as are all my think tank peers.
Brilliant, and we'll probably put the links up on the Dunn Street Dunn Street Facebook and all the other sort of social media things as well for people to click on and get involved. Before you go, let's quickly, this is the bit where those who are not into baseball can stop listening. But before you do go, don't forget, please, if you listen to the podcast and you enjoy it and you listen to it on Apple Podcasts, make sure you subscribe via Apple Podcasts and leave a review and give us a rating because it helps us with building momentum and an audience for the podcast. We've started from scratch, but over the last 5 episodes, we've grown week by week, which has been amazing. And the feedback we've been getting from people who have been listening has been fantastic. If you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, please share it amongst your networks. That also helps grow the podcast. We've got some great guests lined up into the future. But the more people that know about it means that the more popular it is, means that I have more clout to go and actually talk to people and say, hey, you should come onto this podcast. It's the only social democratic voice in the podcast world for Australia. Please come on the show and come and talk to our audience. So by you sharing and promoting the podcast helps me get some leverage and bringing some really, really good guests on going forward. So please do that. Now, Brett, let's talk Red Sox.
Excellent. And let me just say, Stephen, congratulations on setting up the podcast. I think it is a really important contribution to public debate in Australia and, a good format where people can have conversations.
Oh, Brett, I appreciate that. And you can come back again next time, for sure.
Excellent.
Look, you and I are both avid members of Red Sox Nation, and we've had some wonderful years since 2004, not to mention last year's World Series victory in 6 games against the 5 games, sorry, I should say, against the LA Dodgers, which happened right through the high point of the 2018 Victorian state election. And I was working at CHQ, and let me tell you, it was challenging because there were TVs everywhere, and I had to stress to all of my colleagues, please do not put on the sport. And when the news would come on, at 4 o'clock and then 5 o'clock and then 6 o'clock and then 7 o'clock, I had to go work in another room because eventually the sport bulletin would come up and it was going to be up there because I was watching the games that night when I got home, and some of them went, as you know, extra innings, and one of them I didn't get to bed till 2 in the morning. But the Red Sox obviously are doing really well at the moment. Historically, given the pain that the team has experienced over a century. But this year has been a bit of a hangover for us where... we're playing 500 baseball right now. We're 34 wins, 34 losses. We're 8 games behind the Yankees and the Rays in the American League East. What are your thoughts on how this season's panned out so far?
I think it would always be hard to repeat the sublime levels of last year in terms of how great that, whatever it was, 105 win season, I think. I can't remember exactly, maybe more, that we had last year. It was just a brilliant season where everything clearly clicked. And, you know, I was watching yesterday's game, in fact, where we blew it in the late innings. You know, towards the end of the game, this stat popped up about, you know, last year's sort of amazing, you know, whatever we did, 85 wins whenever leading in the eighth inning or something. And this year it was, you know, quite a lot. Well, the season's only halfway through, but quite a lot less. Anyway, the percentage-wise of what we were winning or how we were blowing games. So, yeah, it's a sobering come down. You know, I've got some Boston friends who seem to be rather generous, given that, you know, that they lived through a lot more terrible years on the Red Sox than I have, where you know, they are now saying, oh well, you know, we've won 4 times in the last 15 years, so, you know, so if other teams win, we're not so happy. I'm in the camp that I'd love to win every year. So it has been a little disappointing to see. It's one of those things. We've still got essentially the same highly talented team as last year, so maybe it is literally just a hangover.
Do you think they should have brought...
the fact that we were never going to compete at that level, and you know, coming down from the high, which probably carried on well into the postseason, well into the off season, you know, as well, and carries on now. But you know, just like in politics, how we often seem to forget the lessons of the past, I do wonder whether the Red Sox managers at the moment have forgotten the lessons of the past. Where I recall in I think it was 2003, maybe 2002, where we decided we were going to, based on sabermetrics and statistics, have closer by committee. And that didn't work then, almost 20 years ago, and I'm not sure it's working now. And I was even looking today on a website, and there was, you know, stats around the fact that individually the guys who are closing when they're pitching through the 6th, 7th, and 8th innings are really doing very well, and then they hit the 9th, and for some reason it all blows out. So whether it is simply psychology or whatever, I think one cannot underestimate the power that having a dominant closer gets you. And given we don't have one, although, you know, I'm not unhappy that we traded last year's closer, because I wasn't sure by the end of the postseason that my heart could handle much more of the shall we say, excitement brought about by Kimbrel in closing for us. But
stress headaches, like proportions that I've never experienced before.
But I think that not having a closer is probably a mistake this year. You know, we're still not out of it, but you know, it doesn't help when you lose a lot of games. You know, people say baseball season is 165 games long. You don't win in April. Well, I disagree with that. When you lose more games than you win in any given month, it puts you behind the 8 ball.
The offense hasn't fired as much as it was last year. Like Mookie Betts is, you know, hitting 260, 270, whereas last year he was up, you know, over 300. JD Martinez is just over 300. Andrew Benintendi sort of 260. I mean, there are a couple of standouts, like Devers is having a breakout season. He's doing quite well. Christian Vasquez, when he is behind the plate, is also hitting quite well. But overall, our run production in crucial games hasn't been what it was last year. But I did see a stat the other day that we've produced more runs than the Yankees or the Houston Astros, yet we are 8 games behind them. So obviously we're bashing teams up that aren't that very good, but when it comes to crucial games where we need to get the win, we just can't seem to deliver.
Yeah, I think that seems to be it. It's you know, I wouldn't say necessarily choking, but it's clearly against the higher quality opposition, we're not bringing it home. So yeah, I don't know whether it is just a continuing rolling hangover or what, but it might be time for you know, Alex Cora to do what managers do occasionally and have one of those come to Jesus team meetings where everything's thrashed out and see if that helps them pull up their socks.
Do you predict postseason baseball for the Sox this October?
At this point, I would not be holding my breath. And I will be looking forward to the fact that in a few weeks' time, I'll actually be in Fenway Park for the replay of the World Series against the Dodgers. So I'm looking forward to that. But that might be the highlight of my baseball watching season this year, I fear.
Oh, you kept that quiet. You didn't tell me that before we started the podcast.
In fact, I'm having a couple of weeks off and going on a little bit of a baseball road trip through the Midwest. But the highlight will be returning back to Fenway Park, where I haven't been for a number of years to watch a game. So,
Rightio, I just to extrapolate a bit that what stadiums are you taking in when you're traveling through?
So we got Kansas City and St. Louis and Chicago and a bit of minor league baseball in Toledo because minor league baseball is always fun, and then ending up in Pittsburgh. So a place I haven't been to see baseball before, so I'm looking quite forward to it.
That's fantastic. And obviously, I'm assuming when you're in Chicago, you'll visit 1060 West Addison.
1060 West Addison. We will be there for Wrigley Field for, I believe, John Lester Bobblehead Day.
You've got it all worked out. You should run tours.
No, exactly. Well, if this one works out, I might just do that. I might decide that running a think tank by day and baseball tours by night might be the way to go.
Absolutely. Brett, look, it's been fantastic having you on the podcast today, not just to talk about Red Sox baseball, but also obviously the more substantive things for our listeners, and that is the policy of our wonderful movement and how we can collectively try and make our nation a better place to live and raise families. We wish you the best of luck with Chifley. You've done a great job since you've come in there 18 months ago. You've got some big challenges ahead, and can I just encourage anyone who's still listening to this episode, please go onto the Chifley website and register your interest. The more people in our movement that are involved in the development of our policy, the stronger our party will be and our movement will be. Whether you're active in your local branch or if you're not, please get involved in Chifley and make your contribution to shape hopefully more successful state and federal Labor parties. Brett, best of luck in the future. Thanks for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me, and good luck with the podcast. I think it's a great addition to the landscape, as I say.
And go Sox.
Go Sox.